North America, as a region, is known for having an inefficient academy system that leads to contract deadlocks, a high retention rate of players who are considered underwhelming domestically while being objectively inferior internationally, and until this year, an underutilized amateur circuit. When Golden Guardians made the choice to field a roster consisting of 2 amateur players, 1 academy player, and a player picked off of a Latin American team, the community response was lukewarm at best, despite the relatively frequent calls for North American teams to put additional effort into searching for new native talent. Many people were hit with the initial question as to who these players were, and it's my intention to try to lend insight towards these players, whether you may have missed games during the Scouting Ground Circuit, NA Academy, or the LLA. As a foreword, I'm not going to waste your time and disguise this video as me explaining how these players are going to absolutely crush their competition, so I'm going to be blunt, this team will almost certainly finish in last place. But that doesn't mean that this team has no potential to make waves, or that they won't be interesting to watch. They just have a much larger barrier to overcome relative to the other teams. One last caveat before I begin, since SGC finished around 5 months ago, some of these officially streamed VODs are permanently lost to time, so I have to dig around for relevant clips to properly illustrate what I'm talking about. So if you ever wonder why the quality of the B-roll I'm showing is varying, that's the reason. The mirrors just aren't in amazing quality. I'll begin with top laner Niles. A pretty common discussion point when people talking about Niles is, can Niles play weak side? I think this is a pretty ignorant question to ask if you have any even precursory knowledge of Niles as a player, either in solo queue or in amateur. I think a much better question to ask is, should Niles play weak side? Not to the extent that he's the best player on his team, since I don't think that League is a game that's as simple to dichotomize as the best player should always be on the strong side and get all the resources. But before I get into that though, I think it's case enough that Niles, while not being exemplary on the picks, showed absolutely 100% that he can play tanks that naturally lend themselves to weak side convincingly. Ornn, Malphite, each were relatively common picks from Niles, and he was more than willing to take a backseat to his bottom lane, who were one of the strongest in SGC. That being said, MU's playstyle naturally lent itself to being played through topside, beyond just Niles' pool. MU was one of the only teams that made active use of jungle support 2v2s, and with a weaker than average mid laner, Niles was the natural recipient of this support jungle pressure. It's not that he couldn't play Ornn or Malphite or be useful or even just go even in poor matchups with low resources. It's just that his relatively expansive champion pool lent itself well to receiving counterpick, particularly carry counterpicks, and he was capable of converting these leads into wins for MU. Funnily enough, the only top laner I'd 100% consider superior to Niles is Tenacity, who I think has a relatively similar playstyle to Niles, which makes comparisons easy. During SGC, a critical issue Niles faced was playing around long-range engage in regards to his side waves, and consequently pushing his side way too far while improperly syncing waves with the rest of his team to coordinate pressure. Shady and Iconic were both relatively decent at setting up vision for Niles' split push, but Maryville's cross-map coordination, or maybe just Niles' over-eagerness to push waves, led him to getting collapsed on, while Maryville was incapable of trading vertically across the map. Don't get me wrong though, Niles did exhibit much better control of the side wave than most other top laners throughout SGC, and he likely had the best lane mechanics aside from Tenacity. The combination of Iconic's topside pressure and Niles' power in lane, as in his better trade patterns and just generally being less likely to fuck up his wave, relative to the rest of the SGC top laners led to a pretty deadly combination, where MU was extremely hard to crack on the top side, and frequently generated leads, especially on red side, where they could secure Niles' counterpick. In LCS, I really don't think Niles will have as great of an opportunity to simply outmuscle his opponents and passively generate leads off things like fucking up his wave less. That's sort of a cop-out statement, but at the same time, I do think picking up Iconic in addition to Niles was a great call. Since Iconic definitely played heavily around Niles during SGC, and they clearly did demonstrate positive synergy, it's not a random pickup since they just happened to be on the same team. That being said though, it's plain to see that Niles has a good degree of potential. While Rodolph may have been better during periods of SGC due to his higher level of versatility, which may just be confounded by his role on the team, a lot of the aspects Niles frequently has troubles with, at least in theory, should be fixable if he's provided with the correct environment to do so. On the other hand, Iconic is someone who's been around in the amateur scene for what feels like forever, and while he is extremely stylistically diverse, capable of playing nearly every single jungler that I can think of, I think he particularly excels at the more early game focused junglers that function as catalysts for their laners, or maybe just the majority of the teams he's played on work best with those sorts of junglers. There could be confoundment at play. In any case, while he's more than capable of playing Graves, Nidalee, Kindred, and Lilia, I think he's particularly good at Olaf, Rek'Sai, Trundle, and while she doesn't fit into the other three champions I just listed, I really like seeing him play Sejuani too. Whereas Niles was very comparable to his peers at the top of his class, like Tenacity, due to their stylistic similarity, Iconic is not similar to his contemporaries like Kenvi or NXI in SGC, or Keel in the Fall Amateur split. In line with the meta playstyle of the time, junglers during SGC would typically play selfishly and try to path optimally while taking away as many enemy camps as possible in order to snowball themselves out of control. Iconic was much more like Kitsuo in the regard that he generally prioritized pressuring his lanes in order to acquire favorable lane states, even on junglers that were regarded as ones that would prefer to have laners play towards them, like the aforementioned Kindred or Graves. Don't get me wrong though, while he's capable of playing the current meta jungle playstyle, which he especially showed during the fall season of Amateur, his most remarkable games in my eyes were on the more supportive picks, where he displayed, in my opinion, a relatively high understanding of lane matchups compared to the rest of the Amateur junglers. Junglers are notoriously hard to gauge how well they will fare in the LCS, but since Golden Guardian stylistically isn't dissimilar to the Maryville Iconic came from, he has the advantage in the regard that his mid laner will be capable of facilitating any style Iconic chooses to pursue in the spring split. I can't really talk about jungle without talking about mid lane, so I will try to explain how I see Iconic and Ablazeolive working together after explaining Ablazeolive himself in order to substantiate my argument. While Maryville mid laner Wolfie underwent a good amount of criticism throughout the SGC due to his weaker than average laning and mechanics, his champion pool was actually relatively solid, or perhaps more accurately, Maryville had an accurate assessment of what Wolfie was capable of accomplishing and what he was not capable of accomplishing. They were incapable of performing melee flexes into solo lanes, but Wolfie was good at most control mages, and he would frequently play for mid lane priority, which allowed Iconic to have agency throughout the early game, even if it limited the cards Wolfie was capable of playing with himself. Maryville, when they did crack, would often buckle under the pressure of stronger mid laners who were capable of outmuscling Wolfie, as the strength of their side lanes would often neutralize Wolfie's CS deficits in mutually scaling control mage matchups. To keep it short, Maryville really favored control mage versus control mage matchups. Wolfie was incapable of playing most assassins, and while he had a pocket LeBlanc, it was less than spectacular. Maryville suffered when the enemy team threw resources into the mid lane and tried to crack Wolfie. Ablazeolive is a straight upgrade over Wolfie in the regard that they usually play similar. They both actively play for priority and pressure sides in the early game when they have a winning matchup in the middle lane, as opposed to being content with generating CS advantages. The exception of this, obviously, was when Ablazeolive was placed in inert 2v2s, like Corki and Graves versus more threatening 2v2s that forced him to play more cautiously. Even in these situations, though, Ablazeolive showed an aptitude to coordinating with his jungler and breaking out of the mid lane to at least influence the proximal jungle, even if his teammates in the side lanes were out of reach of his influence. Although, Ablazeolive had a very hard time against losing mid lane matchups, and it's very clear that in many of these instances that they were a team that absolutely required mid lane priority in order to facilitate Chime's greatest strength in his cross-map rotations. This is demonstratable to the degree that, generally, Golden Guardian's Academy had a very hard time pushing advantageous mid lane matchups where they didn't have push advantage, such as Akali versus Azir or Galio versus Twisted Fate, and this is further substantiated to the degree that Golden Guardians would succeed across the map despite having an unfavorable mid lane matchup, provided they did have push advantage, in instances like Twisted Fate versus Sylas. By putting these two pieces of information together, we can see that Iconic and Ablazeolive, at least stylistically, make sense to pair together. Iconic made very good use of the priority Wolfie played for actively in the mid lane, and Ablazeolive has demonstrated his capability of playing similarly for his jungler. Now we have to face the real question though, and this is as blunt as it comes. Is Iconic actually better than Hard? This isn't an easy question to answer in a competitive setting, but I would put forward the argument that Hard had a very difficult time influencing lanes, particularly past Zion Spartan in the top lane. Throughout Golden Guardians' 2020 Academy season, Hard was pretty much in his ideal element, and while he may not be mechanically outstanding enough to be a highlight player on picks like Kindred or Graves, his Nidalee was definitely an outlier in this regard. In many games, when having a poor jungle matchup, or if Golden Guardians were to fall behind in the early game, Hard would default to farming throughout the game without having the mechanical faculties to push the lead he would acquire over the enemy jungler by spending his time farming. In contrast, Iconic is a player who's very active in pushing his advantages, either throughout the map by utilizing the mid lane priority he was granted by Wolfie, or by punishing the enemy jungler in advantageous jungle 1v1 matchups. Just to finish off this section, and since I haven't really mentioned it yet, Iconic really fell on his ass in Scouting Grounds, but I'm willing to forgive it to the degree that Gibble and Plux were some of the objectively worst players of the event. APA was fine, but he just wasn't up to the caliber of NXI and Yunbi yet. Spawn was fine, but playing through AD carry isn't really possible when your support is one of the worst players at the event. I know this is basically apologetics, and I'm not saying Iconic played well, it's just that his team probably wouldn't even make SGC top 6, much less be competitive at Scouting Grounds itself. Iconic and Ablazeolive have a very tall task ahead of them in LCS. Players simply working well together isn't enough to do well against the higher tier of competition, but it definitely somersaults them ahead of teams with dysfunctional mid-jungle 2v2s like CLG or Immortals if Insanity chooses to pursue a similar style to Summer. The biggest thing I'd be looking for throughout spring would be putting Ablazeolive and Iconic in comfortable positions in order to facilitate their success. Ablazeolive will benefit from Iconic being generally better at translating his leads relative to Hard, and Iconic will benefit from Ablazeolive being a general mechanical upgrade in mid lane, alongside having a higher propensity of playing melee champions. Their struggles will come in that it is very important for them to have strong side lanes in order to expedite with what is, in my opinion, Iconic's best style, which is pressuring said lanes and giving them a lead over their opponents. Clearly, Niles is a good recipient of these resources, but that leads us to the final hurdle Golden Guardians must cross, which is their bottom lane. I'm not going to talk about Stixite here since I would like to focus on the newcomers to the LCS for Golden Guardians, but I'll probably refer to him later. I just say this now because I would feel bad about completely ignoring him. Finally, we have Newbie from the LLA. While All Knights' Alive was nowhere near bad, I think Newbie was the stronger part of the bottom lane, and was likely the best support in the league, while Alive had to contend with White Lotus's resurgence during this year, and Leza taking up the role of AD carry solidly for Rainbow 7. That being said, none of the supports from the LLA really have surprised me, and Newbie is no different. The level of play in the position is generally low. I usually don't like to take out specific examples out of people's play, but just to throw out one critical error I routinely see Newbie make is his map rotations. In XTN versus AK, after Shu Hari ints, he runs mid lane with Death Tempo, and XTN dumps summoners to kill Kiefer. I don't really care to argue the efficacy of this play and whether it should have worked or not, or if Newbie being there would have changed anything, but Newbie pathing basically straight to lane is the most puzzling thing ever. This isn't a one-off trend either. Newbie does this a lot, but this was one of the most egregious instances of this. The wave is easy for Alive to control here, and it will likely crash, forcing KSED to base in order to match Alive's base, and Newbie will have a free timer to move on the map. This is obviously the optimal move, but what actually happens for some reason is KSED stays on the map, which gives All Knights complete control of the wave, and with the wave on their side alongside I'm an advantage because KSED didn't base on Crash for some reason, All Knights just play slow push to Dragon and their scribs go completely unpunished. Newbie could have easily went top in contested Crab since XTN just dumped Summoners mid lane alongside Death Tempo with teleport from Kiefer. They have the winning topside matchup, so nearly all of Unforgiven's topside should be forfeit unless they blow teleports, which is itself a victory since that had set up for a dive on the Karthus before he hits level 6 breakpoint, when he could probably deny the dive using Karthus combined with Pycult, but hey, it's a video game, I don't care. All Knight's bottom lane in general was sort of uncoordinated, and I can speculate that there was a sort of language barrier involved that had negative influence on the pairing of the Argentinian Newbie and the Korean Alive. I think this effect would be ameliorated if not solved outright by pairing Newbie with someone who can at least speak English. Even if Newbie's English isn't fantastic, the cognates are there, and it would be way easier to communicate than with someone whose languages are further apart etymologically. I will say though, Newbie does have strong mechanics and great tank positioning, which are solid fundamentals for supports. This might be the dumbest thing I've ever said, but I'm just gonna say it anyway. I wonder if Newbie would be capable of learning to some degree from Chime, who's a support who's actually really good at reading the map. In any case, these things are way more teachable than the aspects Newbie already excels at, which are the bare bone mechanics. I think Newbie will be probably middle of the pack at best, but I only have his recent performances in LLA to consider, and I think he has a good head start on the competition considering his strong basics. In conclusion, I think Golden Guardians' topside definitely makes a lot of sense stylistically. It's literally Maryville SGC with a mid lane upgrade. The integration of their bottom lane seems difficult to me though. Stixay had a really bad 2020, particularly in the laning phase, whereas Newbie's biggest strengths are in lane, and he demonstrably had a relatively more difficult time reading the map and arriving at the correct locations on time. Furthermore, during SGC, Maryville support Shady offered Iconic a lot of space. Maryville was one of the only teams that made effective use of support jungle pairings in order to facilitate the placement of vision and make cross-map plays away from bottom lane. This is something I haven't seen Newbie do much of, at least during the laning phase, and Iconic may not look as good on the big stage without having Shady's extra hands. I think Newbie is an upgrade over Shady during lane, but he doesn't have the legs Shady has. Furthermore, Stixay really needs to return to form in order to make this team work. Without having a strong AD carry, Niles will bear a tremendous burden. It's not as though Ablazeolive is incapable of carrying himself, but he was much better at helping his teammates create those leads, like Tactical when he was on TSM or Zion Spartan on Golden Guardians. If Stixay is capable of making a comeback, Golden Guardians could be a team with two solid carry threats in side lanes and a cohesive mid-jungle unit in order to facilitate either one of those sides from taking over the game. While Niles, Iconic, and Ablazeolive may be completely untested on the professional stage, if they can work well with their bottom lane, they could overcome the odds and perform much better than expected. That's it from me. Sorry this video took so long, but between exams and feeling really sick, I kind of fell into a rut. It's pretty unlikely that I'll land on a team for 21 Spring, even for proving grounds at this point. Kinda unlucky, but whatever, so I'll probably just focus on making YouTube videos for a while. And I'd like to make another one before the semester starts on the 9th. Thanks to KingMe as always for the thumbnail. He's the greatest of all time, and I highly recommend him for all of your graphics related needs. And thank you for watching.